vulnerability is really that intersection between beauty and terror. Like, sometimes you love someone so much that it hurts, and it's a beautiful feeling, but it's so close to pain as well. Like, for me, that's what vulnerability is. Like, there is no distinction between joy and pain when it comes to vulnerability. It's really being open to both.
I am so grateful to have the opportunity today to speak with you, Nadine.
My pleasure.
I would just start by asking you to talk a little bit about how you became an arts writer and curator.
Well, I would say that it almost happened by accident. I kind of wasn't really raised in a family that really appreciated art. I wasn't really exposed to that much art while I was growing up. I always had a love for literature, though. And my teachers in school really encouraged me to write. So I knew that I had a love for like film and books when I was young. But I would really say the defining moment was when I was 23. I was on a Fulbright scholarship and I landed in New York. And I had never been to a museum before, contemporary art museum, believe it or not. So I walked into the MoMA then. A friend took me. And there was this show by Mona Hatoum, who's a UK-based Palestinian artist who spent a lot of time in Lebanon. And so the title of the exhibition was Here is Elsewhere. And it was like my first time abroad in a big city, everything was new. But I think what really struck me was that here was this artist who was invited to curate a show who's from the Arab world, so who I could relate to very much culturally, who curated this show about all the artists and works that have influenced her practice, many of which were feminist works. And I can't remember exactly which work that really, really, really got inside my head, but I remember I was looking at this video. I think it was a Cuban artist who was hitting her head against the wall. It was a performance piece. And I think at that moment, I felt like I had just left my body. I felt like I was just in the grip of this work that spoke to me, by someone from a completely different context, curated by someone from a similar background to mine. And I was just blown away, And I think then when I returned, or it was actually before I had started writing, it was actually before that moment, I had started writing a lot about the art world and films. I was doing reviews. I was quite active in the literary magazine during high school, but in university, I was also, I guess you could say, a cultural reporter. I just fell into, I guess, the arts as an extracurricular activity. But I never thought of actually being part of the art world until I saw this show. Then I was, then it was just that feeling of like, you can feel something so strong that it takes you outside your body. That was the feeling that, I think is the reason why I'm in the art world. And it's also the feeling that I keep trying to capture, the sense that you can get out of whatever situation you're in when you see a work of art, whether it's painful or ecstatic, it can completely take you somewhere else.
I think it's amazing that you were able to step past what I'm assuming are the expectations of your family, or were they open to whatever career you wanted?
I mean, to be honest, my mom always encouraged me. I think she's the reason why I love books. She noticed that I loved to read when I was younger and I had this intellectual curiosity, and she really fueled it. And what's funny is that I was also really good at art in school, but I just never had the guts to become an artist because I felt it would be too painful in some way. I always scored really high, and there came a time when I was depressed in my teen years, and my mother, was asking me what would make me happy. And she, enrolled me in these art classes. I think she had a sense that I had a creative side, but I was miserable. I did not want to pursue. It's really a complicated relationship that I have with art. It's kind of like the relationship I have with writing, which is very painful for me. And it's taken me time to find joy in writing. There's an impulse that comes, or a drive that comes from a point of suffering, which is where, my art emerges or my writing emerges. But so, no, I think initially they were very encouraging, but it was always clear that university, would be something, that was functional in a way. And I come from a larger family that is wealthy, but my own family went through a lot of hardships, especially, the Lebanese Civil War. They lost everything. And so I was like on scholarships, and I really had to struggle for my education, not in terms of grades, but in terms of just being able to stay in school. Like I was always on scholarships, and it wasn't guaranteed that I'd be in school the next year. We needed a lot of help. But so actually my undergrad degree, funny enough, was in business, and that was by process of elimination because I wanted to study literature. But the question that I received from my parents was like, oh, do you want to be a teacher? And I knew that I didn't want to be a teacher, so I didn't study literature. And of course, architecture would have been too expensive, or I was really good at art, but even today, I know very well why I'm not an artist. I don't have the patience, I would say. And I think I want to be surrounded by art, but the kind of art that I want to make is very private. I want to be exposed to other people's work in a sense. Like it's for me, it's really the transcendental quality that lures me towards art, but I don't want to dig too deep in myself. I'm much happier kind of digging into other people's psyches than kind of digging into my own, if that makes sense. So I was writing a lot in university, and then for my graduate studies, I studied anthropology. And anthropology is really the practice that I use in my writing. It's the way in which I approach people and their work and their ideas. Let's say taking or history framework, or a very empathetic, a position of radical empathy. I really learned that from anthropology, as broad as anthropology is, but it really gives you a practice.
Can you tell me a little bit more about radical empathy? Because I don't know what that is.
If you just think, Marina Abramovich, or you just think of some of the more violent body forms of art, and like how, watching those, you could reach the point where you would feel what the performer is feeling. Like there's the suspension of disbelief that occurs in theater, but there's also this sense that you could really transport yourself into someone else's mind and body and feeling, and you could take another point of view that's not your own for a minute or two. It's that sense of like, the human that's behind the work as well. It's really, where is the work coming from?
Was Marina Abramovich the woman who, I'm trying to remember, among other things, sat at the table in the
Yes.
museum and just looked
Yeah.
at people and they cried? Well, they
Yeah.
responded in different. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a beautiful idea where artists are using their bodies as their main medium, if you think about it, which makes a lot of sense. And it's also a very radical gesture.
Her work, I'm not nearly as familiar with it as you are, but I think I watched a short film about her, or I read something about her, and I was really struck by how open she made herself to other people and what kind of response that engendered from people. So, realizing how unique it is really to sit down and look another human being in the eyes, especially a stranger, it's outrageous how unknown that is as an experience and what an impact it has on people. It almost feels like something that could be really natural, but today just isn't, where we just don't grow up with whatever we need to be able to do that and be that open to other people.
That's interesting. I didn't think about that. I think there was more to fight for, perhaps, in the past when it came to art. And a lot of the wars have been won, right? In terms of what you can do and what you can't do. And so now there are other priorities, there are other concerns. And now where I'm at, there's a lot of like work on how do we look at the body in a place where the body is policed both by forms of conservatism, social conservatism, not necessarily religious, I would say, on the one hand, and on the other hand, technological surveillance. You know, where can the body be completely at ease and free? And so I'm really interested in this concept. I'm interested in it in a culture that I'm familiar with, you know, where there are all these attitudes of shame and, kind of privacy around the body. And so I find it very interesting that there seems to be an explosion of work or an interest in that, I think primarily with women, but men as well. And obviously, the different pandemics, epidemics, and so on and so forth have affected the way human beings relate to one another, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's been such a, I, I'm just saying this off the top of my head. I have no idea if this is actually true, but it feels like there's been such a tightening and closing, and at the same time, such an open yearning for connection with other people.
Yeah, I think we're more open to forms of suffering that are shared, but at the same time, we are more insulated in our suffering, if that makes sense. It's a paradox, but like that's kind of, because the first thing is like your family and your loved ones, right? That you care for, or someone or those right? It's very hard to care for those you don't know.
What would you say was the biggest risk you've ever taken in your writing?
Um, I think recently, so was it last year? No, it was the year before, 2020. I was no longer a full-time editor. And it was just that experience, after 10 years of giving over a piece of writing to an editor to take care of after having spent all this time. Obviously, I had editors when I was a senior editor. I had other people look over my work, but I had reached the point where I could have the final say in a sense. And it was a very big responsibility because I often would massacre my own work. I was a tough editor on people and on others and on myself. But there was a story that I pitched that was actually taken by Art Monthly, and it was just called Letter from Dubai. And it really was about how when the pandemic, the news of the pandemic, or at least when the lockdown began and we just transitioned from working in the office to working at home in March. That was before I was still an editor then, but the shows that were around me in Dubai somehow all had to do with darkness. Darkness in terms of intolerance, in terms of ignorance, but also in terms of night, in terms of light pollution, in terms of, all these different facets of what darkness can mean. And I was writing that from the position of being in Dubai, not knowing where to go next. Beirut had just had that terrible explosion in August, which, just brought this real anxiety about not being able to go back to the closest I had to home for a long time. And, it's kind of me trying to write something from an extreme place of vulnerability, and I failed. I think it was so emotional that it had to be edited, and then after the edit, it kind of lost the personal touch because I wasn't able to manage between kind of commenting on what was happening around me and my own uncertainties and anxieties and just panic, I guess. And I really felt that that was a risk. It was a very difficult task that I did. That really sticks out to me as a story that didn't quite hit the spot that it was meant to.
Fail
But
is a
after,
tough word. Sorry to interrupt you, but fail is a tough word to put on yourself for that.
but it did fail. It definitely, when I read it afterwards, it really wasn't the story. Like it just, there were so many levels of distance between where the story emerged and how it was formed. And it was because I really think it was because I was too close to it. Because there's a certain level of distance that you need in order to write well. At least I do. And yeah, so it just really it's something I look back on as not a great work, like, but coming from a very, authentic place, but like it didn't end up, the final story was not authentic in a sense. It did not reflect what I wanted it to reflect, and it had nothing to do with the edit. It was wrong from the beginning. You know what I mean? So I think that was the greatest risk of me launching myself into becoming an independent writer again with that subject, was probably a risk.
Can we come back to this idea of writing as painful? What it is that
Mm.
you find painful about writing?
I think it's just the way, it's the way I began. So I think I began writing when I was younger as a way to make sense of difficult feelings. And so it was more for me, and you could just consider it as not really a diary, but probably extended prose poems. And then I, you know, ended up writing as a professional, completely stopped at some point. I mean, not immediately, but then I stopped the personal writing and then I learned how to master it. So I developed this kind of skill like a surgeon, excising and splicing and like putting it together, with a certain level of distance in order to be able to shape it to what you want to be. And also, it's not about you anymore. And I think the way I used to use my writing to deal with certain emotions when I was younger, I found that the best way to deal with them when I was older was to abstract myself from them rather than delve so deeply through language, because it was just language became my access to that point of pain. So I had to really develop a different relationship to writing and to language in order to extract myself from those moments in a way without ignoring them. But I had to, because my relationship to language was one of suffering. That's why for me, writing is still painful because it symbolizes that distance from that place. At the same time, it's estranging, and that's why when I tried to write that piece, I feel like I failed, but then I did something else. I wrote a poem about loss, and I think that worked really well. I did edit it quite a bit, and I did have my partner, who's also a poet, kind of help me break it up. And I had to, in a way, what's so interesting was the poem, I think, was not a failure, and I actually showed it in an exhibition. The poem worked because of everything I took out of the poem. It was what I left out that made the poem. And I think with the distillation in the poem, it really became that thing, like sometimes there's a lot in what is not said, especially with language. The strongest writers are those who cannot be edited because every word is in its place and no more, no less, It's just about being exactly what it needs to be, There's a distillation that occurs in the craft of writing, that I think the form of the essay that I tried to explain these feelings of darkness and uncertainty, maybe if it was a photo essay or if there was a different way to express it, it would have worked better, It definitely, the poem was another attempt, and it really did capture, the loss of that of that time that I was, kind of feeling.
But do
Yeah.
you think you could have written the poem if you hadn't written the essay first?
Probably not. It was probably the way the essay fell short that made me, because that I needed to write that, but it wasn't necessary for the essay. And then, of course, in that poem, I talk about losing my mother. And, because it's tied up with the loss of home, obviously, right? And there were a lot of things that I really wanted to be in there. And it was beautiful to be edited by my partner who was like, you don't need this. And then there were things that I could keep for me in that poem, but it still spoke to so many others. Especially when you are a writer, it's an identity that you're putting out there and that can't be changed. It remains. It's a big responsibility, I think, and it's the only word I can think of is self-exposure. There's something about it that's really, really personal in some way. But my writing did become did come from a place of suffering, and I think just like any melancholic, teenager, I always felt more inspired by sadness than happiness. Like could never even write two words when I was happy or excited about something. But when you suffer, that opens you up to a whole other world that can be really nuanced and really profound. And a lot of empathy comes from that place. Like, sure, joy can be infectious, but where you really feel for someone is their pain, right? The pain. I always kind of grew up thinking about the suffering of others and my own suffering. But yeah, happiness was not something that kind of impacted me in the same way, strangely enough.
I mean, I paraphrase very, very loosely because I don't know the line, but was it Dostoevsky who said, happy families are all happy in the same kind of uninteresting way, but unhappy families are really interesting in their own unique ways. Something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would agree with you. I think I'm also drawn in that direction as well, as what I find more personally resonant or what draws me in more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
That would be true. So you mentioned that, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I just want to make sure I understood correctly, but you will do or would consider creating art, but not to share.
Yeah, I'm saying art very loosely. I just think that now that I'm, kind of delving into curatorial practice again, something happens when you collaborate with an artist and, you fuel each other conceptually. And a curator has a lot of impact on the final form a work will take. You know what I mean? But again, you're like the hidden co-author, the hidden co-producer, the hidden mentor. So that for me makes more sense than me trying to create my own art. I think writing is already the is my tool, and is what I know how to do and how to tap into. But kind of going into art, I think at this stage in my life, it's not something that I want to do. I really decided, in a way, I was I was the daughter of my parents. I was very practical. I just thought about it and I was like, no, I'm not going into this. The path will be long and hard, and I'm just gonna do something I'm good at. You know what I mean? And I enjoy, obviously. I mean, in a masochistic way, but still, nevertheless, I do enjoy it. But mind you, I mean, it was a big fight. To go into culture, like my family didn't really understand what I was doing. I had to do it. When I say on my own, I mean at the point when I could, get my own scholarship for grad school. I had to, like, it wasn't something that was encouraged or understood. And I think it was more out of a certain level of care of not having a very secure profession, and it is precarious. But in my opinion, I think for me, it's art is the reason I survive emotionally, intellectually, mentally. It really, I couldn't live without it. You know, I think I was always searching for something more when I plunged into all those books and stories when I was younger. And it's not that it's an imaginary world, but it gives you the ability to experience the world more intensely. And I think that's what draws me towards art. In small moments, you know, you really can access other spheres of thought and feeling through an artwork than you could, you know, I don't know, anywhere else. I really think, I mean, I don't have hopes that art will change the world, but I think the world would be very dreary without artists, you know, like it just wouldn't be habitable in any way.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Nadine. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. So did I.